So let's check in on good old Zoran Mondani today, who is currently under scandal after it was recently revealed he's taken at least $13,000 in illegal foreign campaign contributions, mainly stemming from Middle Eastern investors overseas, which I have to say is completely on brand for Zoran, because first of all, he's obviously a Democrat. We know that many of the people who prop up Democrats electorally and politically are not even American. But furthermore, Zoran himself, the very guy who just seems like a gigantic op, right? He is sure well-spoken for a Democrat, but his smile is so big, it's completely fake. His life story, his background, the whole thing completely fake. And his support itself even is astroturfed, right? He's only on track to win about 40% of the vote in his city, but simply because the field is all divided around him between Cuomo, Sliwa, and formerly Eric Adams, he's going to cruise to a victory and then claim, I won by 20 points. I clearly have a mandate, when that is not the case. But such is the nature of basically the entire political left, right? The people who constantly pose themselves as being these grassroots political activists. Every time you go down the rabbit hole, it turns out they're massively funded and propped up by the very billionaires they claim they're protesting against. And the entire thing, as usual, is completely insincere. And this is no exception, as we'll tell you about this scandal here today that actually does get a little bit worse, because not only was he found to be receiving foreign campaign donations, investigative records show that he has not returned, his campaign's not yet returned the vast majority of that money that they're supposed to immediately give back. And it turns out, on top of that, even some of these illegal donations are coming from members of his own family. So the entire thing is weird, but like I said, completely on brand, and we'll get into it. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. That is the best way to support our work and ensure that we can keep bringing you these videos. And that said, so here is the reporting out of the New York Post, who first revealed this story. So, lefty socialist and mayoral frontrunner Zoran Mondani's campaign quietly took nearly $13,000 in potentially illegal foreign donations, including one from his mother-in-law in Dubai, the Post has learned. So again, even a member of his own family. And by the way, obviously, right, he props himself up. He claims that he lives in like a rent-stabilized apartment. He's a really poor working-class guy. Meanwhile, his family are like these weird international people who like grew up in Uganda, but, they were probably like wealthy in Uganda. The whole thing is strange. And then you got a mother-in-law, apparently, who's like a Dubai millionaire investor, really? Mr. Socialist, but oh, look at me, I'm with the people, right? But that's typical, right? Champagne socialist behavior. It's a trend that repeats itself throughout all of history, frankly, from Fidel Castro liking Rolexes to Bernie Sanders to this garbage right here. Many such cases is all we have to say. Now, here's what's really interesting. At least 170 of the nearly 54,000 contributions to the leading Democrat candidate's campaign came from donors with addresses outside the United States. An examination of the New York City Campaign Finance Board records found, obviously, only U.S. citizens or permanent legal residents are allowed to contribute to political campaigns and political action committees under federal, state, and city law, and candidates are expected to return any of the illegal donations. Violators who knowingly accept foreign donations could face hefty fines and imprisonment. Well, look, in Zoran's defense, you could say he doesn't know how many people go to Act Blue, but isn't that a little bit strange? His own mother-in-law in Dubai is apparently included in this list of allegations. And I'd further like to point out, just as in yesterday's video when we talked about Antifa International and the fact that there's a huge funding network behind a lot of the supposedly grassroots revolutionary left, that even when it comes to the Democrat Party itself, this is simply following a long string of dark money scandals dating all the way back to when we first started to speak about Act Blue. Remember earlier this year, for those of you who have been on the channel a long time, are you just familiar with this story, how the top Democrat fundraising website and payment processor that the entire party has was basically set up so that it encouraged credit card fraud from stolen cards and people overseas because it didn't require the CVV code? Just saying.
FEC data shows that some senior citizens across the U.S. have been donating thousands of times per year. Some of these individuals' names and addresses are attached to over $200,000 in contributions. We went and knocked on a few of their doors to corroborate the data that we received. We're wondering if these donors are victims of what appears to be a money laundering scheme. Cindy No of Annapolis, Maryland, who in the year 2022 allegedly contributed over 1,000 times to Act Blue, totaling $18,849.77. That means Cindy would have had to donate 3 times a day, every day for the whole year. My name's James O'Keefe, and we're doing a story on the number of people that have donated. You did donate to Act Blue, right?
Once in a while.
What about $18,850?
No, I don't think so.
You know people are using your address?
I don't think so.
Yeah, well, we've brought up this point before, but isn't it so interesting in every single election since the 2010s that when you looked at the cash on hand advantage of the DNC versus the RNC, or the Democrat candidate versus the Republican candidate, the Democrats always had this massive, almost unrealistic fundraising advantage over us, i.e. the $1.5 billion Kamala Harris campaign where you really had to ask, where in the world does that money come from? And yet suddenly now that Act Blue is under congressional investigation, when you look at those fundraising numbers, they've inverted, right? The DNC is cash broke. They don't have anything. Yeah, it's almost like the entire Democrat machine that is supposedly having so many people who support it and supposedly is so, grassroots and all of these things. Yeah, massive fraud there going on. And then Zoran Mondani, right? Running as the even anti-establishment progressive Democrat, not really liked by the institutions of the Democrat Party, but it's almost like at the end of the day, they really are the same. Go figure, right? Being propped up apparently by foreign donations. But so far, as it turns out, the campaign has failed to return 88 of the foreign donations worth a total of $7,000, records have shown. So they're not really taking it all that seriously. I mean, they probably think it's... After all, right? If no human being is illegal, right? We should have open borders, no immigration status. Then what? No dollar is illegal, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I guess this is what they believe. Hey, don't be xenophobic. Why can't foreigners come and donate millions to American political campaigns? What's the problem with that, right? So anyways, Mondani's campaign has brought in $4 million in private donations, scored another $12.7 million in public matching funds, and with less than a month ago has nearly $6.1 million on hand. Well, I'm sure they're going to be using that for righteous causes. Okay, I'm sure they're going to be rolling over much of the leftover campaign money to actually helping New York citizens, and certainly not buying a new mansion for Zoran Mondani, right? You know what BLM stands for, buy large mansions. Anyways, his campaign issued a statement on Saturday saying, quote, "We will of course return any of the donations that are not in compliance with CFB law," after being provided a detailed breakdown of the 88 donations yet to be returned. A campaign spokesperson, however, declined to clarify why so many foreign donations are in Mondani's war chest, because that does seem to be a lot, right? Like, why does that keep happening? And what do these foreigners even have to gain donating to an American political campaign? It doesn't even really make sense, does it? Unless there's a return on investment, maybe? I don't know. Maybe that's why so much is coming from the Middle East, because I'm just saying, right? He supports the protesters who say they want to globalize the intifada in the streets. So is that what it is? I'm not sure. Anyways, a campaign spokesperson... Oh, so I already read that. The foreign donations have sparked criticism. Quote, "Where there's smoke, there's fire, so I would be very concerned," said the Republican mayoral candidate Curtis Sliwa upon learning of the foreign money coming into Mondani's campaign. There's probably a lot more in terms of foreign money. And by the way, I would probably venture to guess that's true, right? If this is the amount of foreign money they found, and it was like 170 something donations, how about those who maybe are doing it more covertly or the system is not showing, right? Anyways, 2 months ago, Sliwa, during an interview with Fox Business, called on the U.S. Department of Justice to investigate his suspicions, which, by the way, others like I believe Brandon Straka have brought up as well, that Mondani is being aided by difficult-to-trace dark money illegally being funneled into super PACs through foreign nationals. And so that's really interesting, because this has been an allegation around Mondani for a very long time. Suddenly now it is coming to light. And again, isn't that so interesting how the grassroots anti-establishment progressive is massively propped up himself by dark money? So anyways, the Mondani campaign has given back a paltry only $5,000, including the contribution from Baria Darari, however you say the name, from Star Wars, the mother of Mondani's new bride, Rama Duwaji. Okay, so the mother-in-law, they did give back the money, but anyways, that did come from Dubai, and she did not return requests from comments. So I think you basically get the idea here, right? Among the biggest donors was James Furlod, an environmental scientist at Australia's University of Tasmania, who pledged $2,100 to the campaign, who studies the effects of climate change and all that stuff. Someone else, basically, Ada Diaz Ahmed, who is a Dubai-based investor. Very strange. Very capitalist of them, by the way. Donated $2,100 to the campaign in September, records show, and it goes on and on. Here's someone from Canada who gave $250. Here's a Islamic migrant in Germany, apparently, giving $250. Someone in Canada. And you notice they're basically all like Middle Eastern people, even those who are not actually living in the Middle East. So anyways, there you have it. But hey, on the topic of money, I do want to delve a little deeper into some of the campaign promises he is currently making. Because after all, Zoran has now pledged about $10 billion worth of free stuff, like the amount of you get a thing is getting utterly ridiculous. And of course, a question many have raised is how exactly is he going to pay for that? Because he doesn't have the unilateral authority to just raise taxes on the rich in New York City like he's claiming, at least to the extent he would need to be doing it, right? So where's that money going to come from? It's not going to come from the state. It's not going to come certainly from the federal government. How are you going to pay for the free buses? Well, we finally got the answer, right? He's going to take the live golf tournament strategy and basically just sell New York City to Saudi Arabia. And then that's how he's going to get $10 billion. I don't know. But in all seriousness, I want you to take a listen recently to how ridiculous some of these campaign promises are getting, because I have a lot more to say in a second. But first, check it out.
To afford the more than 12% increase in rent-stabilized apartments under this Mayor Adams administration, and struggle to afford what has now grown more than $20,000 a year in childcare costs. And so what we are releasing today is the cost-saved calculator, where you can go to Zohran for nyc.com/calculator and see just how much each of these big three items will save you in your lives. Because when it comes to free buses, each rider will save over $2,000 a year. That's $1.3 billion a year for all riders. When it comes to universal childcare, we're speaking about $22,200 a year, which together is $5.5 billion for every New Yorker across this city. And when it comes to a rent freeze, we are speaking about $1,750 saved every single year. And together that amounts to more than $1.7 billion in its first year. These are the figures that add up in the lives of New Yorkers. These are the figures that together would save the people of this city more than $8 billion.
Yeah, well, needless to say, New York City is completely screwed. Because putting aside my jokes about selling the city to Saudi Arabia, you want a real example of how these policies are going to end? Just look at London or Berlin or any of the European cities in the West right now dealing with the exact effects of these exact ideas. And that's that what? For instance, on free buses, right? What is the real problem with free buses? It's not just the cost, although it is expensive, and it should be a legitimate question of how are you going to pay for it, Mr. Utopia? But again, let's just assume, for instance, about my theory joke that, well, you know, a Middle Eastern oil sheik is going to come fund the free buses on his own. Okay, fine, fair enough. You know what the problem with it will still be? You want the real answer as to why free buses would suck? Is because they would be extremely dirty and dangerous. Why is that? Because, for instance, look at the type of crowd in New York City who is hopping the turnstiles, and then, at the subway, I mean, right? And then correlate that to the people who are stabbing each other, robbing, attacking one another on the subway. Needless to say, when you make something free, who is going to take advantage of that, right? Vagrants, criminals, homeless people who are going to sleep on the bus, drug addicts, etc., etc. And as if public transit was not already enough of a nightmare in most of our northeastern cities, ladies and gentlemen, you just made it 10 times worth of the free buses. So as I stated here, yes, indeed, all of these quote unquote free things will be completely unusable because he wants to not only make them free, he also wants to further empty the prisons, invite illegals, decriminalize drugs, which is also a policy of Zoran Mondani. I'm sure that's going to work great on the free buses, right? Smoking crack on the free buses, and encourage antisocial behavior across the board. Let's just not forget that part of it as well. Not only does New York City also already have massive problems with this stuff, he further is calling himself, saying that violence is a social construct and he wants to basically reduce the prison population in New York City by half so they can all ride the free buses. And ladies and gentlemen, how exactly do you think this experiment is going to end? We know the answer. That's the real problem. We should make that clear with Zoran's policies.
All right, I'm Sweeney. I am down here outside of the district's attorney's office here in Lower Manhattan. And for all the videos I have ever published, guys, I have never once asked you to reshare them. I've never once said spread them to your friends and make them go viral. But as God is my witness, I hope this one goes mega viral with no vested interest to myself, only for the safety of New York City residents. And it'll be a short one, okay? I'm going to start off with a demand. I'm going to paint you a very scary picture, and then I'm going to end it with a question. And here's my demand. Stop pissing on my leg and telling me that it's just raining. For all you folks that are saying, oh, Zoran's not radical, he's just capitalism with a few social programs. He just came out with a press release saying he wants to abolish misdemeanors. And thankfully for you guys, I'm an attorney, so I can explain to you guys what a few misdemeanors are, all right? Third-degree assault, third-degree drug possession, theft, larceny, DWI, forcible touching. For that crusade of women that was across, social media last summer saying, where are all the strong men that aren't coming up to protect us when someone touches us on a subway? Even if I did what I wanted to do, which is step up and knock someone's Zoran would arrive and say, cops, let him go. That was just a forcible touching. It's not a jailable offense, which leads me to my final question. Zoran, what kind of peyote are you smoking?
Yeah, and again, I want to make it very clear to people. This is the real problem with Zoran's candidacy and likely future mayorship. It's not just the kind of like Looney Tunes socialist ideas of how you're going to pay for that, you're going to bankrupt the city. No, the most immediate threat to your own safety are policies like this, right? Abolishing misdemeanors, emptying the prisons, and then sending all the prisoners to ride the wonderful free buses that I'm sure you're going to be wanting to share with convicted felons and drug addicts and all that stuff. And very interestingly and hilariously, by the way, the very study that Zoran cites on this issue, talking about why free bus fares are so good and so important, actually reads the following. Number one, the funniest part about this article is the suggestion that folks who struggle to pay a $2.90 bus fee are now meaningfully contributing to the economy of the most expensive city in the world, which is something I have brought up as well, right? When it comes to affordability issues in New York City for the average person, what is actually crushing people? You could say rent, insurance. Who was ever saying, oh, like my life would be fundamentally changed if I did not have to pay $3 for the bus every day? Like that's kind of silly, number one. But secondly, what is the real crux of this policy and who is it really designed to benefit? Again, the vagrants and violent criminals. For instance, this strongly mirrors what happens in Kansas City when they tried this. After introducing fare-free buses, incidents dropped 39% from 2019 to 2020. Why? Because by eliminating the fare box, riders did not need to interact with bus operators, interactions that were often the source of altercations. In other words, right, this study that he is citing, in terms of their whole reason as to why free buses are so good and so amazing and so needed for ordinary poor people, is basically stating the reason why violence went down on the buses is because we just let the crazy criminals on instead of them trying to fight the bus driver physically because they didn't want to pay the fare. So yeah, instead of terrorizing the bus driver, let's just terrorize the bus passengers now, ladies and gentlemen. That makes so much sense. And, this is the real thing that progressives in the West fail to understand about their own policies, is that when you kind of open up everything, for instance, you open the borders, you open up prisons, and you generally encourage, as I said here, antisocial behavior across the board. Because, for example, you don't think that people should be, told to leave or locked away if they're like smoking crack in the park in front of children or something like that. That's what I mean by kind of like antisocial behavior. And by the way, just crime and other just like hooliganism and degeneracy in general, right? That all of your progressive programs inherently start to fail. And as I wrote here, these ideas are not inherently bad, which is to say they can work in some societies, but they only work in high trust societies, right? I further stated that progressivism has entirely failed in all Western nations simply because they don't understand this important fact. What exactly am I talking about? Well, for example, Bernie Sanders, for a long time, has always quoted the Scandinavian countries, or in some cases Canada, saying they're so amazing because they have free healthcare and all these social programs, and it's a much more kind of comfortable society in terms of a social safety net, and it's such a utopia. Now, here's the thing, right? I would argue that, say, in the 1980s, maybe 1990s, before the migration crisis, one could make the case those programs were actually working decently well in those countries, right? People were kind of happy with it. And I know that some conservatives are going to say, oh, they never work, they never good. I'm not necessarily saying it's what I want in my country. What I'm just simply pointing out is that when you actually have a high trust society, you can pull off a lot of different types of policies that would not otherwise work. What do we mean by that? Well, first of all, let me just kind of explain this concept of social trust. So as one example, right? One could say that in your own household with your own family, you kind of practice a form of socialism or communism, right? Your children, for instance, if you're a father, and maybe even your wife, if she doesn't work, right, kind of have these universal guarantees. You feed them, you redistribute wealth in a sense. And, no one is going and screaming, oh, that's socialism, that's communism. But why is it? Because you guys are family. See where I'm going with this, right? You guys have a connection to one another, a bond, mutually speaking. The same is true in society. For instance, a country like Sweden, right, before they opened their borders, at least, and you could look today to a country like Japan or South Korea, same thing, where, there is this social trust, your neighbor, it's smaller to a degree. In those cases, as it turns out, and you kind of see throughout history, a lot of people are actually willing to, for instance, like pay more in taxes because they understand kind of the bonds between one another. They can see where that tax money is going. And so I would argue historically, right, there's a reason a lot of Europeans had no issue saying, oh, I'm happy to pay 40-50% in taxes because we're going to get it back. It's going to help my fellow citizen. And then, we have these universal guarantees of things like healthcare and stuff. And because there's social trust, the system kind of works. But again, what happened immediately when they opened the border and encouraged all of the very antisocial behaviors and policies that I'm currently describing? The whole thing fell apart. Europe is now in crisis. Why is that? Let's go back to the family analogy, right? So you have no problem helping out your family. And for instance, I'm sure many people would say, if you have like a sibling who just lost their job and they fell on hard times and it's not because they're addicted to drugs or something, no problem in saying, hey, you can come stay with me for a little bit and I'll help you out till you get back on your feet, right? Because you're my family. But now what happens when a random crackhead off the street shows up at your door and says, hey, I'm on hard times, can I stay in your house? Well, obviously, you're going to be like, what the heck? And the same is true in society. Understand, right? When it comes to an issue, for instance, even like migration, when people stop to know their neighbors, when it starts to be a breakdown of that social cohesion and social trust, notice how these types of progressive systems inherently cave in on themselves, right? When people stop wanting to pay high taxes because they don't know their neighbors, that becomes a problem. And guess what else? This is the issue of social trust. Social programs start to fail when the takers outweigh the givers, which is to say, you have more like vagrants or migrants or whatever it is coming in to take things from the system than you actually have a tax base that can sustain it. This is why, for instance, progressive economics is incompatible with open borders, because you cannot just share that system with the whole world. It's going to bankrupt itself, right? And this happens, frankly, in a lot of socialist systems where people stop working or contributing to it, and that's why you have starvation and all of that. So that is simply to say, when progressives so often ask, they'll look at a country like Japan and say, why can't we have a public transit system like theirs, or China or something like that, Korea? There's your answer. When you look at the Scandinavian supposed utopia, that is no longer utopia, but even before the migrant crisis basically tore apart social trust in that society, there's your answer. And there's your answer also as to why Zoran's progressive ideas could not work in New York City even if he tried, simply because these leftists in the West cannot get over the idea that in order to make progressive things work, you have to have things like strong law enforcement, strong police, and a high trust society, right? Like, if you're going to have free buses that actually work for people, you need to have strong security guarantees that people aren't going to just take advantage of the free buses, that vagrants aren't going to use them to just sleep on them, that people aren't going to be doing drugs or attacking one another, but progressives refuse to do this. And because of that, because of this utopian idea that, like, a high trust, progressive social sharing system and an open society with criminals and illegals and vagrants and all that stuff can coexist, that's why ultimately Zoran's ideas are all going to come crashing down extremely, extremely hard. So anyways, just something I wanted to address, because that's been on my mind about this, constantly hearing, by the way, so many Zoran supporters are like, what's the problem with free buses? It's perfectly fine. Yeah, I would say if I was a citizen of like Japan, it might actually be perfectly fine. I might even say, yeah, maybe we pay higher taxes for better public transit. Actually, that's fine. But guess what? You're not in Japan, buddy. You're in New York City, okay? Things work a little different. Social trust is not nearly what it is over there. And there are reasons for that. But again, to have the idea you're going to open the prisons and then make everything free is probably the worst bullcrap you have. Like, that's the worst possible combination of leftist ideas, you know? That's actually even worse than like Soviet communism, because at least they were tough on crime, you know what I mean? Like they kind of forced people to make sure the communist system worked to a degree, right? You know, you didn't get away with like just you know, stabbing people on the subway in Moscow under Stalin, okay? I would virtually guarantee that type of stuff was not happening, you know? But they want to take this to another level, and it's truly insane. But anyways, that said, guys, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.